Hi everyone. So I'd like to talk to you about kind of the basics about your pattern for a minute here. All right. So this might seem a little more basic than most, but what I do want to point out here are a couple things. First of all, I assume we all recognize what this arrow is. This is a grain line. This means that this arrow should be perpendicular to your seam allowance. So when you lay this out, this is not kind of going whatever way that you want it on the fabric. It has to go with the grain. Otherwise, once you make this skirt, what can happen is that if it's on some kind of a bias, it can stretch, it can grow, it can warp, it can twist. It will ruin the skirt or the garment in some way. All right. Now, the first thing that I've done here is I haven't actually fully finished cutting this out yet. However, what I will mention to you is that this pattern, what you might notice about it, is that it's wrinkled, right? It's wrinkled, still has the factory folds in it. Now, what you should never do is take your wrinkled factory folded pattern and use that to sew with or to cut your fabric out with without ironing it first, all right? You really want to iron this down first, so that way when you use this for cutting, everything is accurate. So for instance, something that's very common with these patterns, see here, maybe you can't see, I'm not sure, but there's basically like little pleats forming on the pattern. So when I pull them apart, it flattens. Now, if I just go ahead with laying this on fabric with all these little pleats and all these little, all the way it's contorting itself because of the way that it's currently bended and wrinkled, it's going to distort my pattern. I'm going to lose some width. It won't be as wide, it won't be as long, things will be weird, lines won't be straight. So it's really important to iron any pattern before you begin sewing. So I'm going to iron this pattern and I will get back to you. So I have now ironed these patterns and you're going to see that they are just really beautiful looking now, okay? The paper is nice. There's no wrinkles everywhere. Obviously, you will still see some amount of factory fold residue, as in these long creases where it was folded into the pattern, but it's not a big deal. They're fine now. Now, just so you know, in case you've never ironed a pattern, yes, I use my iron that I use to iron my fabric, okay? It doesn't need to be on high heat or anything like that. No steam. You just kind of rub it on the paper until it flattens. It's pretty intuitive and user-friendly, okay? And that just irons your pattern so it's ready to go. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is the way you're going to find your size, just preliminarily. Now, we've probably done this before in our other sewing classes, right? But if you measure your waist and you measure your hip, then that should give you the measurements asked. So, for instance, I measured my mother, right? So, waist, she hit at a 29, and there's a 28 right here and a 30. And then she was at a 38 hip, there's a 38 here and a 40. So, I would likely go off of your waist measurement, and then we can trim in the hip as opposed to going, or sorry, uh, uh, mm, the hip is going to be wider. Depends on which one is widest for you. So, Uh, if you are bigger waisted than you are hipped, it's important to accommodate the part that's bigger. Okay, so I would go with whatever is larger for you. If you're more hippie, we can always take in the waist. If you're more wasteful, we can kind of trim it in the hips. We just need to make sure that it fits the largest part of you, if that makes sense. So for my mom, I went with the 28 and 38 um, waist because I also think that because of the way that I measured her, she had a little extra going on. Now, what we want to mention is that these measurements here are not always correct. So let's talk a little bit about how we're going to find exactly what our size is. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is I need my measuring tape, right? And I need to measure my pattern itself. Keeping in mind, I have seam allowances here. This is my center back, this dashed line. They provided it for some reason. And remember, I have seam allowance on this side, okay? So I can go ahead and measure it from here. And I'm going to measure it to my dart, stop measuring, and then measure from my dart to my seam allowance. So you can just measure to the edge and then subtract your seam allowance. So I can say, all right, I'm starting here. My mom is going to be, I think, maybe the size. So let's see. Okay, so she is going off of the measurements of the 14. So I'm going to, from here to the second dart, because it's the 14, so 3 and 5/8. And then from here to here, 3 and 3/8. However, I still have seam allowance here, so I'm going to subtract my seam allowance amount, so 2 and 3/4. And then scratch paper helps me do this, but 2 and 3/4 plus 3 and 5/8, I think, is equal to, let's see, 5, 3, 5, 6, and then it's very late at night, 6 and 3/8, I believe. So my front now equals 6 and 3/8. If you were lost with what I just did, you need to remember seam allowance, seam allowance. Those do not count for my measurement. So I need to measure from wherever my stitching line is, which is likely not drawn on your pattern. For some reason, the center back here is, to my dart, from my dart to my edge, and then I subtracted the seam allowance from this edge because I did not have a nice drawn line here. I added these two measurements together, and I got the measurement of half of my, is this the back? This is the back. That's half my back. So for my waist, 6 and 3/8, that's half my back. So times 2 is equal to 12 and 3/4. Great. Now I need to measure my front. I could also measure my back hip while I was here if I needed to. Now we're going to measure the front. Now we have seam allowance here, but the front is actually on a fold. You can see here, and it says cut on the fold. Front's on a fold. So there's no seam allowance along right here. Okay, there's no seam allowance here. So I'm going to measure from my edge to the dart. And I didn't even, I was just talking. Let's see. We're at 4, 4 1/4 from here to here. 3 and 3/4. So 4 1/4 plus 3 and 3/4. And we got to minus the seam allowance here. So 5/8. 3 and 1/8 plus 7 and 3/8. So I just added this to this. So we're at 7 and 3/8 times 2 is equal to 14 and 3/4. Okay. And now I can just add my front to my back, and I get, let's see, 12 plus 14, that's 26, plus 3/4, 27 and a half. Okay. So sometimes these measurements can be a little different. Okay. Now, something you need to keep in mind is this. If your waist, okay, if your waist is, let's say, 28 inches, you do not want the pattern to fit at 28 inches. you need a little room for ease. You need at least total 1 additional inch for ease at your waist. Okay? This is so you can move, this is so you can breathe. So whatever you measure at, if you measure at a 25-inch waist, you need to go with a 26-inch waist, okay? Now we will go over some changes you can make to that in another video. Similarly, we want to make sure that we are doing okay with our hip, all right? So let's go ahead and measure our hip. Now this is the front, so I'm on the fold right here. This is the hip line, these two double lines right here, as the pattern states. So there's no seam allowance here at the center front. I don't got to worry about that. I just got to worry about the seam allowance here. So I'm at 10 and 5/8. So just remove 5/8. I'm at 10 inches times 2 is equal to 20 because this is going to be folded. So there's 2. Then I'm going to look at my back. Now, these might be even. They may not be. I'm not sure. They might both be 10. And from here, I want to measure over. And I'm at, once again, it's about 10 and 5/8. So I'm also at 10. So it is even. So that's 20. So 40. I'm at a 40-inch hip. The pattern said it would be a 38-inch hip. However, it was not. I have the 2 inches I need. So just, for ease, for wearing ease, like I said before, you need 1 inch more at your waist, but you need 2 inches more at your hip. Okay? So if you are a 38-inch hip person, you want an ideal 40-inch finish pattern for your garment, okay? The reason we don't count seam allowance is because we want to know what our pattern, how our garment is going to measure when it's finished. Do we understand? So depending on the numbers you get from that, then you can verify, okay, yes, this will work for me, or no, I need to try a larger or smaller size, okay? Because if you have 4 inches of ease at your waist, well, that's going to be too big, okay? So hopefully, if I can just reiterate a couple points here. We've ironed our pattern, so that way it's more accurate. We've measured our waist from stitching line to all the appropriate stitching lines, making sure not to count seam allowance amounts. And we've taken, for instance, center backside, side backside, added them together, and multiplied them by 2 because we have 2 halves, right? We're measuring the amount of our full body. And we repeated the same thing in the front. Then we made sure to measure our hip, multiplied it by 2, measured the other hip, add them together, got our amount. And from there, we can configure what we need to choose for our initial pattern. We may make some changes, and I will cover that in the next video. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to make sure before we moved on that we understood what I meant when I was talking about measuring from stitching lines. So, as we may probably know, we have seam allowance when we sew clothing. So, for instance, a seam allowance you might be used to is 5/8 of an inch. Okay, that means that from the edge, the cut edge of your fabric, 5/8 from that edge would be your stitching line. This is where, when the fabric is overlaid together, you stitch on that line, and then you have leftover seam allowance. Same thing would also apply to your waist, since we're going to be sewing the facing at the waist edge, which means that when your garment is finished, it's not this black outline, the cut line of your garment, the cut line of your pattern, that is the measurement. It is these lines here. These red lines indicate your stitch line, okay? So notice how I'm not including, let me use another color. Let me use a nice blue of this pencil. I'm just going to slash out everything I've slashed out in blue is seam allowance. That's all seam allowance. So once my garment's sewn, this is how this amount here, from here to here and here to here, these kind of dictate, let me do it this way, these kind of dictate the actual measurement of our waist, okay? Not the cut edges of the seam allowance, okay? So I just want to make that clear so you understand what I'm saying. If you ever need to, you can always use your gridded ruler to help you. You can also measure with your measuring tape 5/8 from the edge so you know where to start measuring, okay? And of course, you can also just measure from the cut edge to wherever and then subtract the seam allowance afterwards if you don't want to finagle with holding it in the right place, okay? So for instance, I could measure all the way from the edge of the seam allowance to the dart and then just subtract the seam allowance amount, or I could figure out exactly where the stitch line is and measure from there to the dart. Okay? Hope this cleared that up. I just wanted to make sure I was extra specific with you. Okay, thank you.